Hello, welcome to another video about the Lucian. So we've just experienced a symposium on the Isle of the Blest with the winds acting as servers for the party, and the glasses which are plucked from the trees and magically refill themselves or fill themselves up when the person puts them down next to them. There's now a little gap, a little break in the story. And it's not actually a huge amount, but there is a chunk which the exam board has decided to miss out. So I've given you this little introduction at the top. You know, the party is followed by poetry and song, and because we're on the Isle of the Blest, there are some famous people around, heroes of the ancient world. So we see Homer, the poet. Lucian spots Homer, and also Odysseus as well, and Socrates, and a number of other philosophers. The skeptics are missing presumably because they can't agree whether or not the island exists. They are skeptical about it. And also, you may have heard of the philosopher Plato. He too is missing because one of Plato's great achievements in his Republic is his work, The Republic, is to describe the ideal state. So in Lucian's mind, Plato doesn't live on the Isle of the Blest. He lives in his own ideal world instead, which he described in his philosophy. So we rejoin the story a couple of days later, and Lucian has plucked up the courage to actually go and talk to Homer about Homer's life and Homer's work. A couple of pages after this, in fact I've forgotten if I put it after or before, no, afterwards, a couple of pages afterwards, there's a little explanation of this in this page, which is marked up as the Homeric question. There it is. The inspiration for this passage, which we're about to read, there he is asking, "Who am I?" The inspiration for this really is the fact that nobody really knows who Homer was. The Iliad and the Odyssey were clearly written sometime around sort of 750 BC or something like that, not long after the introduction of writing to the Greek world. The Greeks inherited a writing system from the Phoenicians, but before that time, before around 750 BC, they couldn't. Well, they basically didn't write. There are some other Greek languages which appear in the Mediterranean and are actually older than the Greek texts that we have, but they died out. So things like Linear A and Linear B, which you may have heard of, they are writing systems that existed in the ancient Greek world, but the Phoenicians brought over the idea of an alphabet, and that probably is the impetus for much of the creativity that we have from the Greek world, the fact that they could actually write things down. And so at around that time, around 750, somebody wrote down these epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, these great poems which had been produced orally. They're works of oral poetry, and probably were sung and performed with musical accompaniment. About that time, somebody wrote them down. The reality is that we don't know whether the man who wrote them down was actually called Homer. That's the name which is given to him throughout history. And we don't know whether he wrote both the epics or whether or not they were written down by different people but have similar styles because of the fact that they're both works of oral poetry. There are also a number of lines in Homer which scholars, both ancient and modern, are uncertain about whether they really belong in there, whether or not somebody's added them later. So there are all sorts of questions about this. And Lucian, who happens to be able to be on the Isle of the Blest and is in Homer's presence, wants to have these questions answered. Again, obviously this is an imaginary encounter, so he's putting in his own thoughts into the story, but giving them through Homer's words. So it's an interesting style of approach. He's having an imaginary conversation with a person who is possibly a historical figure, and doing so, allowing him to give his own opinions. The reason that I think this is quite so interesting is that there's obviously a very similar debate about Shakespeare and who actually wrote the plays. The primary contender, aside from Shakespeare, being a man called the Earl of Oxford. So I thought it linked quite nicely with the history of our own most famous playwright, and I thought that's useful. So the discussion with Shakespeare obviously is very different. We do have historical records that we know that Shakespeare was a real person, and we know that he was working in London. The debate with Shakespeare obviously stems from the fact that he's not an aristocrat, basically, and in my opinion, the debate is mostly about classism. That somebody of Shakespeare's class couldn't possibly have been educated enough to write those plays. Most scholars do not agree with this, but the question does occasionally pop up. Did Shakespeare really write the plays? With Homer, it is very different because we just don't have historical records of the time, so we just don't know who he is. But the name Homer is given by the ancients, both the Greeks and the Romans, so that is what we call whoever wrote these poems down. Anyway, so it's quite an interesting little discussion, I think. It's a couple more sections, so I'm hoping that we'll do one this week and one next week, and then that's all we'll do on the Lucian. There is a third section, but we'll pick that up when we come back in September. So let's have a look now, shall we, and see what he says. Okay, so upor de duo treis hemerai dia leluthesan kai proselthon ego homeroi toi poetei scholes uses amphoin tate ala epunthanomen kai hothen eir. So it's quite a long start, but it's not actually too bad. So let's start with upor. So upor just is a conjunction meaning not yet. Okay, you can see it's negative from the u on the front of it. So not yet, and you've got a de, obviously connecting yourself as well. So and not yet, duo tres hemerai. So 2 or 3 hemerai days. Okay, so they're actually the subject. So 2 or 3 days, not yet. Dia leluthesan. And I've given you a little note on that, which says that this is in the perfect tense. The perfect tense, as I'm sure I've mentioned before, is not one you need to know at GCSE for Greek. Pluperfect rather. The pluperfect tense is not one that you need to know in Greek. So we're going to translate this as had passed. Okay. So not yet had 2 or 3 days passed. That may not sound very natural to you, so deal with it as you wish. You may wish to say something like, only 2 or 3 days had passed. Kai, proselthon egor, and I, egor, obviously, and then you've got this participle in the middle, proselthon. Having approached, it's pros erchomai. Remember, obviously, elthon comes from erchomai, and I, having approached, or just approaching might work just as well in English, but if you want to get the sense of it being aorist, and I, having approached or approaching, and then that's going to take a dative, and here he is, homeroi, and I, approaching Homer, toi poiete, the poet. So Homer is in the dative, so the word poet has to be in the dative as well. And then you've just got this little aside here, scholes, uses, amphoin. And you can probably see that scholes and uses are both in the genitive. This is a genitive absolute. Scholes means free time or leisure, and uses obviously is the genitive form in the feminine of on, usa, on. So scholes, uses, leisure being, and then amphoin. Amphoin is a tricky word. It's in something called the dual form. Ancient Greek has both a singular and a plural, and then a third category of number, which applies to 2 people rather than any more. So amphoin means to both of us. It's in the dative. So with leisure time being to both of us, tate ala epunthanomen. So epunthanomen comes from punthanomai. in the in the imperfect. Usually that means to learn, but it means to learn by inquiry. So it can be to ask as well, and I think that's probably a better translation here. So I asked Tate Allah. Again, I've given a little note on that. Sort of among other things, Kai also Hothen Ayer, from where he was. Okay, so where he came from. Now, there's a lot there that feels rather bitty having gone through it. So I'm just going to run through it again. So, Upo de duo tres hemerai dia luthesan. So, not yet had 2 or 3 days passed. Kai proselthon egor homeroi toi poiete. And I, having gone to Homer the poet. So that participle might be easier in English translated as a main verb. Scarcely had 2 or 3 days passed when I went, when I went towards Homer the poet. Okay, so let's run the whole thing together. Scarcely had 2 or 3 days passed, and I approached Homer the poet. I know it's a participle, but it's probably easier as a main verb. Scholars uses amphoin, leisure time being to both of us, since we both were at leisure. He spotted Homer and has seen him and thought, well, okay, he's not doing anything, I'll go over and speak to him. So scarcely 2 or 3 days passed, and I approached Homer the poet while we were both at leisure, or since we were both at leisure. And I asked him, Tate Allah, among other things, Kai, also, where he came from. Okay, so it's a little bit more straightforward. So where you've got sentences like this that in a literal way, when you translate them literally, are a little bit clunky, it's often best to record both in your translation if possible. Literally this, and then when you're referring back to it for revision, you can see how you came up with a more fluid translation. Okay, but in the end, you want something like scarcely 2 or 3 days passed, and I approached Homer the poet, since we were both at leisure, and asked him, among other things, also where he came from. Okay, so I'm going to leave that sentence there, and hopefully you will be okay with it. Tutogar malista par hemin eis eti nun zde testai. This, again, is a little bit more complicated because it implies a conversation. You may be able to see that zde testai is an infinitive. It's got that estai infinitive ending on it, although because zdete or is a contract verb, the of the stem and the s of the estai have merged to create astai, but it's an infinitive. That implies to me an accusative and infinitive style construction, which implies that this is speech. But there's no verb of saying. There's not a sort of fermi, I say, or a effer, I said. So you need to imply that sort of sense here. So literally, it means for this tutogard malista, especially par hemin, among us, i.e. among Greek people, eis eti, still, nun zde testai, now to be discussed. So that doesn't quite make sense in English. So you can either imply a verb and say, for I said that this, i.e. the question of where he came from, is still especially discussed among us. Or you can just sort of neglect the fact that it's in this indirect statement and say something along the lines of, for this is still a question which is discussed amongst us, and take the zde testai just as a main verb instead, and sort of leave an implied indirect statement in your English as well. Hode ud autos men agnoien efasken rather, hos hoi men kion hoi de smyrnaion, poloi de colophonion, auton nomis dusin. Okay. The hode gives you an instant change of subject, but he. So it's referring to Homer, or and he. And he, ud, from ude, is giving you a negative, and that goes with the efasken over here. Faskor means to say or declare. So literally that should mean, and he did not declare. Okay, but that's the way that a Greek person expresses, he said that something was not the case. So you need to shift the negative away from the main verb. So rather than he did not declare, you want and he declared that something was not the case. Okay, so in this case, he declared autos himself. This too is an indirect statement after efasken, but it's nominative because the Greek, when it's reflexive, whereas in Latin you would say, dixit say, he said himself to be something or other. In Greek we use the nominative instead. So hode, and he, oud efasken, said that autos, he, oud agnoien, was not unaware. Literally, he said himself not to be unaware. Okay, so, and he said that he was not unaware, and then you're going to get what he's not unaware of. So he said he himself was not unaware. Hors has got a variety of different meanings. How, as, since. Here it's probably best translated as that. So he said that he was not unaware himself that hoi, obviously the definite article in the plural, but it's repeated over and over again. Hoi. So you've got a little bit of a sense of it's coming as a set. Hoi, and then that's pairing with poloi that comes afterwards. So hoi, some men. So he said that he was not unaware himself that some men, hoi, and you're going to need a verb with that, and there's this verb nomis dusin at the end of the phrase, which is going to have to be repeated. So he said that he was not unaware that some men, nomis dusin, think, very compressed, you're going to need something for him in there as well, that some men think him Chion, a Chian. Okay, so Chios is an island in the Aegean Sea. So this is a question of where's he from? Well, hoi, some men, nomis dusin, think him Chian. Okay. Hoi de, and other men think him, understood again, Smyrnion, from Smyrna. Okay. Poloi de, but many men, nomis dusin again, and he've got an auton as well to complete that. So many men, auton nomis dusin, think him kolophonion, from kolophon. Okay, so he's agreeing with Lucian basically. When Lucian says, "Well, where are you from?" Because this is a question which is debated among my people. He says that I am aware. I'm not unaware, literally. I know full well that some men think that I'm a Chian, some men think I'm from Smyrna, and some men think I'm from Colophon. Okay? And then you get the answer. Einai mentoi ge elegen babylonios. Okay? So mentoi is a good place to start. However, and then take the verb. Elegen. He said, or literally he was saying. And again, it's going to introduce an indirect statement. He said that. But because the subject of the main verb, the elegen, and the subject of the indirect statement are the same, they're both Homer again, you haven't got an accusative. So he said, however, he said himself, understood, einai, to be, and then what he is babylonios. And you can see that's in the nominative. So it's a nominative and infinitive constructor, some construction, something which is different from Latin. However, he said that he was a Babylonian. Kai para ge tois politais uk homeros. Para again here being used as a sort of sense of among, so and among tois politais, the citizens, i.e. of Babylon. Uk homeros, not Homer, alla, but Tigranes, but Tigranes, kalesthai. Again, it's an infinitive because it's reported speech. So he said himself to be a Babylonian, and among the citizens, not Homer, but Tigranes, kalesthai, he was called. So literally, himself to be called, but he said that he was called Tigranes. Okay. So I'll just run through that one more time. So einai mentoi ge elegen. However, he said himself to be, or he said that he was Babylonios, Babylonian, kai para ge tois politais, and among the citizens, uk homeros, not Homer, alla Tigranes kelesthai, but that he was called Tigranes. So he wasn't called Homer, but was called Tigranes, i.e. the Greeks have given him a different name. Husteron de, let's read the whole sentence first. So Husteron de Homeriusas paratois helesin alaxai ten prosegorian. Okay, so Husteron de, but later and later on. Homeriusas sounds very much like the name Homer, and this is a little pun. The verb homeriuo means to be a hostage. So this, with this pas-pas-a-pan type ending on it, is having been a hostage. So, but later, having been a hostage, still referring to Homer himself, paratois helesin, among the Greeks. So, but later, after he'd been taken hostage among the Greeks, alaxai ten prosegorian. And again, alaxai is an infinitive. This time it's an aorist infinitive. So he said that, there's still in that indirect statement construction, he said that alaxai himself to have changed his name. So he said that he'd changed ten prosegorian, the name, or his name. Okay. So originally he was a man called Tigranes among the Babylonians, but when he'd been taken hostage by the Greeks, he changed his name. Etidekai periton athetu. Sorry, I'll try that again. Periton athetumenon stichon eperoton e hup ekenu en gegramenoi. Okay, etidekai is linking the phrase moreover, or maybe and moreover, and then peri, concerning, and that's going to take a genitive. So concerning, torn, and then torn stichorn. So stichorn, which comes from stikos, is a line of poetry. So peri torn stichorn, concerning the lines of poetry, and they're described as athetumenon. So rejected, spurious. So these are the lines I was talking about earlier on, where we think some lines were not written by him. So, and moreover, concerning the spurious, the rejected lines of poetry, and the main verb is here, eperoton. Again, this is a contracted verb because it comes from erotao, or in this case, eperotao. So it's aor. So that on ending is actually an I ending. So, moreover, concerning the rejected, the spurious lines of poetry, I asked about the spurious lines of poetry. A, hup ekenu, en gegramenoi. A usually means if, but it's probably easier translated as whether here. So, whether, hup ekenu, by him, i.e. by that man, en gegramenoi. And I've given a little note on gegramenoi. This is the perfect middle passive participle. So written is the way to translate it. So whether they were written by him. So if you take that whole phrase, etidekai, moreover, I asked eperoton, periton athetumenon stikon, about the rejected lines, whether by him, en gegramenoi, they were written. So whether they were written by him. Kai hos, usually meaning who, and he, efaske, same verb again, declared, said, pantas autu enai. So this is accusative and infinitive this time after the efaske. So he said, pantas, all, and then the infinitive is enai, which follows, to be, autu, of him. So again, that just needs a little smoothing over. Kai hos efaske, and he said, pantas autu enai, that they were all his, i.e. all the lines which have been classified as spurious or rejected belonged to him. Katagignoskon, un ton amphi ton stenodeton. Sorry, I'll try that one more time. I don't know what's the matter with my reading today. So, stenodoton, ton stenodoton, kai aristarchon, grammaticon polen ten psukrologian. This, again, is a little bit tricky. So we'll start with un, because that's an easy place to start. And so, kateginoskon. So kateginoskon is given in the vocabulary and is, again, a contracted verb, contracted form of gignoskon, kategignoskon. And so, it's augmented. So you've got an so you've got kate rather than kata. and with that on ending on it, that tells me it's imperfect, so I was doing something. And so I deemed guilty. Kategignosko is to accuse someone or deem them guilty. And you need an object of that. So ton, stenodoton. So these names are given in the notes underneath for you. Xenodotus. So I deemed Xenodotus, Kai Aristarchon, and Aristarchus guilty. So if you take that as a phrase together, I deemed Xenodotus and Aristarchus guilty. And then you've got another accusative afterwards, polen ten sukrologian. You're going to need something that you deem them guilty of. When you've got kategignoskon and it's a charge, both the one accused and the thing they're accused of come in the accusative. So I deemed Xenodotus and Aristarchus guilty, polen ten sukrologian, of much pedantry. You might want to say of something like of excessive pedantry, or of pedantry in the highest degree. The only things that we've missed out are the amphi here, so both Xenodotus and Aristarchus, but also you've got this genitive which is enveloping them as well, torn along with grammaticon. Literally, of the scholars, of the grammarians, I deemed Xenodotus and Aristarchus guilty of great pedantry. Yeah, it's probably easier. The idea of the genitive is to show, like, out of all the grammarians, out of all the scholars available, I deem them. That's why I use a genitive. It's a sort of partitive. Out of these, I deem these men guilty. But you might want to just say, I deemed Aristarchus and Xenodotus, the grammarians, guilty of great pedantry. Having done that again for the recording, that passage is potentially more complicated than I imagined when I was just having a quick flick through it earlier on. This feels like there's been a lot to explain, and that this is probably quite a long video. So really take your time with it and ask any questions that you feel need answering. Do get in touch if you need to. Thanks very much. Goodbye.